The letter arrived early, a crisp envelope with the familiar script of the law firm. I felt the paper tremble in my hands as I slid it open, my heart thudding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Today was the day my husband's estate would be divided, the day I would discover what he had truly left behind. I had expected the usual, perhaps some sentimental items, a modest sum, memories solidified in legalese. What I hadn't expected was the cold, cruel clarity of betrayal. My name was on the papers, yes, but the share that should have been mine had been rerouted to her, to his secret mistress, and not just her. Her 3 children, all named as beneficiaries of what should have been my security, my future, my inheritance. I felt the letter tremble in my hands, the paper cutting into my fingers as if mocking me. The scent of ink and polished wood from my desk mingled with the faint aroma of coffee, but it did nothing to calm the storm raging inside me. I sank into the chair, the leather cool against my skin, and stared at the words again, as if reading them a 3rd time might undo the betrayal. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I could hear the faint hum of the city outside my window, the distant honk of a car, but it felt surreal, like life continued on another plane while mine had been upended. Years of marriage, years of loyalty, erased by the stroke of a pen, redirected to a woman I had never known and children I had never met. A wave of anger rose, hot and sharp, but beneath it, deeper and slower, was the cold ache of loss, the kind that digs into your bones, relentless and unforgiving. I knew I couldn't react impulsively. I had to think, to plan, to understand. This betrayal was not just financial. It was personal, deliberate, and it demanded a response as calculated as the act itself. I set the papers down, my fingers lingering on the edges, tracing the names that had replaced mine. Every letter, every word, felt like a challenge, and in that challenge, a quiet resolve began to form. I would not be silenced. I would not be erased. And if this was the game he had set in motion, I would find a way to turn it completely on its head. I spent the morning walking through the house we had shared for decades, each room a gallery of memories, our wedding photos, the artwork we had picked together, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the master bedroom. Every corner reminded me of trust, of love, of the life I thought we had built, and every memory now carried the bitter aftertaste of betrayal. I couldn't let this go unanswered. I needed to know who she was, who these children were, and how he had woven them into a life I had never glimpsed. I started with public records, scrolling through property deeds, school registrations, social media accounts, every trace he had left in the world outside our walls. Piece by piece, I constructed their lives, their routines, the casual ease with which they had been inserted into the legacy that should have been mine. The more I uncovered, the deeper my resolve grew. Her house was modest but tastefully decorated, an attempt at normalcy that mocked me. The children, sweet-faced and innocent-looking in photos, were unwitting pawns in a game I hadn't agreed to play. I could almost hear their laughter in the background of online videos, and it stung, not because of them, but because of what they represented. The secret life he had kept from me, the deliberate division of what was mine. As the sun dipped low outside my window, painting the walls in gold and orange, I made a decision. I would not confront them blindly. I would observe. I would plan. I would find the cracks, the vulnerabilities, the ways in which their seeming security depended entirely on his absence. And then I would act, not out of revenge, but to reclaim what had been taken from me. I poured a glass of wine, the deep red swirling like liquid fire in the glass, and let it calm the storm in my chest. Each sip sharpened my thoughts, honed my focus. I had been blindsided, yes, but I was not powerless. I had information, strategy, and patience on my side. The mistress and her children might have inherited my husband's estate on paper, but I was about to remind them, and everyone else, that inheritance was not the same as victory. The following morning, I visited the law firm. the crisp scent of polished wood and leather-bound files greeting me as if reinforcing the gravity of my mission. I requested a full copy of the estate documents, scrutinizing every line, every clause, every hidden loophole. My husband had been careful, but not perfect. Every legal document carries the faint trace of vulnerability, and I intended to find it. I discovered small inconsistencies, vague wording, unclear property descriptions, and a few outdated attachments that could be challenged. Each detail felt like a small arrow in my quiver, a way to tip the scales back in my favor. I smiled quietly, savoring the thrill of strategy over emotion. Rage was useful, yes, but precision was far more effective. Next, I began observing them from a distance. The mistress had a routine: school drop-offs, grocery runs, subtle indulgences in her lifestyle that hinted at overconfidence. She had no idea her inheritance was being scrutinized, no idea that her security rested on fragile assumptions. Her children laughed and played, oblivious to the tension they had become part of. That innocence, almost sacred, made me careful, but it didn't dull my resolve. I was reclaiming my stake, not harming them. Every day, I gathered more evidence, more details, building a framework that would allow me to challenge the division legally and socially. I met with accountants, estate planners, and a trusted attorney, mapping out options for reclaiming my share. It was meticulous work, slow and deliberate, but each step gave me a sense of power returning to my hands. By evening, I sat in my study, the warm glow of the lamp casting shadows across the walls lined with books, each page a silent witness to my growing resolve. I poured myself a glass of wine and traced the path of the estate on paper, imagining the moves, the counter-moves, the eventual outcome. They thought they had inherited freely. They had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead. For the first time since reading that letter, I felt a pulse of calm beneath the fury, a steady, strategic fire. The game had begun, and I was determined to win, not with chaos or public spectacle, but with patience, precision, and an unwavering sense of purpose. The next morning, I filed a formal petition to contest the estate division. Every word, every clause, every supporting document was crafted with surgical precision. I didn't shout, I didn't demand, I simply asserted the legal truth, that my inheritance had been misallocated, that my rights as the spouse were being ignored, and that there were discrepancies that needed immediate review. I watched the reactions carefully. The law firm handling the mistress's side was caught off guard. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not with such meticulous evidence. The air around the case shifted subtly in my favor, like the first breeze before a storm. I felt a thrill not from revenge, but from clarity. I was no longer powerless. Meanwhile, the mistress remained blissfully unaware, hosting a casual brunch at her home while her children played in the yard. I knew the address, the routines, the patterns, all from careful observation. Not once did I step beyond the boundaries of propriety. My strategy relied on knowledge, timing, and patience, not impulsive confrontation. I began sending letters through my attorney, each one precise and factual, highlighting inconsistencies in the estate documents and requesting clarifications that subtly exposed her overconfidence. Each response was polite, but measured. Her legal team had to admit there were gaps, and the mistress could not act without drawing attention to them. At night in my study, I pored over each response, each counter, each tiny concession. The fire of betrayal was still there, simmering, but it was tempered by control. I could feel the balance shifting. The mistress had inherited on paper, yes, but the structure of the estate, the evidence, and the law were aligning with me. By the end of the week, I could almost sense the first cracks in their sense of security. She believed she had won, but she hadn't yet realized that winning requires more than secrecy and charm. It requires foresight, precision, and patience. And I had all 3 in abundance. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, and the faint, sterile scent of polished wood and leather-bound chairs. I arrived early, letting the silence settle over me like a cloak of calm authority. Every detail mattered: the way I walked, the measured tone of my voice, the subtle confidence in my posture. I was here not as a victim, but as someone reclaiming what was legally and rightfully mine. The mistress entered impeccably dressed, her children trailing behind her like shadows of her perceived victory. I watched her scan the room, her smile tight, confident, or at least she thought it was confidence. She didn't know that every argument I had prepared, every document, every detail of misallocation, had been meticulously reviewed, rehearsed, and fortified. The proceedings began, and I let my attorney speak first, laying out the discrepancies with calm precision. Every clause, every misworded line, every vague designation in the estate documents was presented as clear evidence. I observed the mistress's reaction: small flickers of doubt in her eyes, subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of her jaw. She realized, piece by piece, that the house of cards she had been standing on was not as stable as she had assumed. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I stated facts, laid out evidence, and let the truth of the estate's misallocation speak for itself. I felt the energy in the room shift. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, acknowledging the clarity of my presentation. Each statement I made was measured, precise, and confident. By the end of the session, the mistress was visibly rattled. Her children clung to her side, sensing the tension, but not understanding its full weight. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from humiliation, but from the undeniable authority I had asserted. On paper, she had the inheritance, but the law, the evidence, and the careful strategy I had employed were realigned with me. Walking out of the courtroom, the city air smelled sweeter than ever, crisp and promising. I felt the first true pulse of triumph, knowing that the tide was turning. What had been stolen through secrecy and deceit was being reclaimed with patience, precision, and calm resolve. Weeks passed, and the hearings progressed with steady precision. Each session peeled away the mistress's veneer of control, exposing gaps and weaknesses she had ignored in her haste to claim my share. She arrived with her children, smiles forced, eyes wary, trying to project confidence. But each document, each testimony reminded her subtly that the advantage had shifted. I stayed calm, composed, a quiet presence that radiated authority. I walked into the courtroom like I owned every inch of space, and in a way, I did. The evidence, meticulously gathered, every legal point carefully framed, was mine. My husband's betrayal had been sharp, cruel, and deliberate. But I had learned to wield patience and strategy like a blade far sharper than anger. Her attorney attempted to counter my claims, but each argument I had anticipated. I watched her shift in her seat, the tension in her posture betraying the cracks in her confidence. Even the children sensed the shift. Their laughter was subdued, their questions hesitant, as if they too were realizing that the foundation of this inheritance was not as solid as they had assumed. By the end of one particularly long session, the judge acknowledged the discrepancies and called for a revised allocation. The mistress's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at me, a flicker of understanding passing between us. She had assumed she could manipulate the outcome through secrecy and timing. She had forgotten that true control comes not from hiding but from preparation, clarity, and presence. After leaving the courthouse, the sun glinting off the city buildings, I breathed in deeply. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and rain-damp streets, but it felt cleansing, almost like the calm after a storm. I had begun to reclaim what was mine, not through rage or confrontation, but through strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve. At home, I reviewed the estate documents one last time, noting the adjustments the judge had requested. My share was still partially entangled, but the tide had turned decisively in my favor. The mistress had learned quietly that inheritance without foresight is fragile, and I, with clarity and calculated resolve, was ready to take what had always belonged to me. The final hearing arrived, the courthouse buzzing with anticipation. I walked in deliberately, every step measured, every glance steady. The mistress sat across from me, her children by her side, faces a mixture of curiosity and unease. She tried to smile, tried to appear confident, but her posture betrayed her tension. She had spent weeks thinking she could keep what was never hers to begin with. My attorney presented the final evidence, tying together every discrepancy, every vague clause, and every overlooked detail from the original documents. I listened silently, letting the law speak for me, knowing each point strengthened my position. Her side faltered. Her arguments were polite but weak, each rebuttal exposing further cracks in her assumed authority. When the judge delivered the verdict, it was clear, decisive, and irrevocable. My share, what had been taken and reassigned, was restored. The mistress's eyes widened, disbelief mixing with the faintest trace of shame. The children looked confused, sensing tension but not fully understanding the stakes. I felt a quiet surge of triumph, not from cruelty, but from justice and clarity. I had been betrayed, yes, but I had reclaimed my rightful place, my inheritance, and my dignity without descending into drama. But the court documents, now final, were a testament to patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Walking out of the courthouse, the sunlight was sharp and invigorating, the air crisp with the faint scent of city streets and blooming trees. I breathed deeply, savoring the weight of victory. I had faced betrayal at its most personal, navigated it with intelligence, and emerged not only intact, but empowered. At home, I sat in my study, the familiar scent of polished wood and old books grounding me. The estate was mine once more. Every decision, every asset, every memory was now fully restored to me. I allowed myself a slow, victorious smile, quiet, composed, but absolutely complete. The days after the final ruling felt lighter, almost surreal. The weight of betrayal that had pressed down on me for months began to lift, replaced by a calm certainty that the future was mine to shape. I walked through the rooms of my home, every corner a reminder of what had been tested and what had endured. The faint scent of my husband's old cologne lingered, but it no longer carried the sting of betrayal. It was simply part of the past. I met with the mistress one last time, not in anger, but in quiet authority. Her eyes flicked away when I spoke, a subtle acknowledgement that the game had ended. "The estate has been restored," I said softly, my voice steady and measured. "I hope moving forward, you and your children understand the boundaries. Respect is earned, not taken." She nodded, barely able to meet my gaze. There were no words of apology, no confrontation needed. The lesson had been delivered through clarity, patience, and unwavering resolve. In the weeks that followed, I took deliberate steps to reclaim not just my inheritance, but my life. I reorganized the estate, managed the finances, and ensured every property and asset reflected my control and oversight. I allowed myself small indulgences, a reminder that life, even after betrayal, could be rich and fulfilling. Even more important was the emotional reclamation. I spent evenings with close friends, dinners filled with laughter and storytelling, the comforting hum of shared joy filling spaces that had once been heavy with resentment. I walked in the city, felt the wind on my face, the pulse of life around me, and knew that no betrayal, no secrecy could rob me of my strength. I had been wronged, yes. I had been sidelined and blindsided, but in facing the deception calmly and strategically, I had turned weakness into power. The mistress and her children now existed in the framework I had allowed. Safe, yes, but no longer a threat. And I existed fully, wholly, unshaken, and unafraid. That evening, I poured a glass of wine, the deep red catching the light, and stood by the window overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered, alive with possibility. I smiled quietly, confidently, knowing that I had survived betrayal at its most intimate, reclaimed what was mine, and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbound. The past had tested me, but it had not defeated me, and for the first time in months, I felt complete, whole, and ready for whatever came next.